Great. Then I would like to welcome everyone to our presentation today. My name is Toni Weinstein. I'm chair of the Newmarket Town Council. And I want to first just say thank you for being here. I know, it's a Thursday. I had to think about what day of the week it was. It's a Thursday afternoon, and I know everybody's busy, but this is a really important topic for the region and for our community. So the presentation is titled Rising Waters in Newmarket. It's an open forum on preparing for flooding and sea level change that we all know is inevitable. We're going to take a look at the work that's been done and then talk about some things for future planning. So a couple housekeeping items that I just wanted to get started or mention as we get started. Keep yourselves on mute, please. It can be really distracting to hear background noise and feedback. Keep your video off until we start with the question and answer phase. Any questions that you do have can go in the chat. You could also use your raise hand feature. There will be a couple opportunities set aside for questions. So if we could save those questions for those times. And I wanted to, and again, before we get started, I wanted to also make sure that I acknowledged Dale Pike, who it's really because of his efforts that we're here today. And so most of the people on the call, I'm assuming, know who Dale is. He was a town councilor for several years and was the chair of the council. And before, during, and since his time on the council, he's been very active in issues around water and conservation. He lives on the Lamprey and is very involved in lots of different organizations, from serving on our dam committee to the coastal adaptation workshop that he serves on now, and the Riverfront Advisory Committee, and lots of other things in ways that he's been involved. So, and he really put this together. So I just wanted to make sure I said thank you to Dale. And then we have two facilitators at who I will let them take the show. It's Amanda Stone and Lisa Wise, both from UNH, and they can probably introduce themselves better than I can. So it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much, Toni. And like Toni mentioned, thank you to Dale. We connected with Dale over the summer and started working on pulling this this forum together. So really been great to work with the folks in Newmarket, and I'm really excited to be here virtually with all of you this afternoon. So thank you for taking the time and being here. I'm Lisa Wise. I'm the Climate Adaptation Program Manager with UNH Cooperative Extension and New Hampshire Sea Grant. And I will let my colleague Amanda introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Amanda Stone. I'm the State Specialist for Natural Resources and Ag Conservation with UNH Extension.
Thanks, Amanda. And Kyle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Kyle Pimentel. I'm the Principal Regional Planner at Stratford Regional Planning Commission.
And we also have Natalie DiGeronimo from the DES Coastal Program, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie. I'm the Resilience Project Manager for the DES Coastal Program. It's great to be here with you all today.
Great. Thanks, Natalie. And I want to acknowledge that Amanda and my effort with this program is supported by the DES Coastal Program, and Natalie and the Coastal Program folks were very involved in the development of the resources that we'll be talking about today. So I'm really glad that Natalie can be on here to address some questions and just be part of the discussion as well later. So let's see, the purpose of this session today is to learn more about some recent resources, the New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Summary, and think about how you can use them in your roles in Newmarket, whether you're a volunteer board or committee member or a member of the staff. And so we're going to talk about the resources. There's 2 videos that we'll watch, and we'll also take a look at some Newmarket specific maps, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And as Toni mentioned, if you have questions or comments that come up during the program, feel free to put those in the chat or raise your hand on Zoom, and we'll do our best to address those. But to start, we kind of wanted to take a little bit of a step back. Newmarket has done a lot of work on climate-related issues, particularly flooding and stormwater. And so one of our colleagues, Liz Durfee, has been working with a few folks in the town on putting together a timeline of what Newmarket has already done related to climate impacts. And that is a more detailed document than this timeline displays here, but we'll share that along with other resources in a follow-up email. And so this is kind of a digested version of that timeline. And so we just wanted to take a moment to highlight a few key points in kind of the trajectory of what Newmarket has been doing. And the timeline starts back in 2006, where there was some extreme rainfall that caused flooding on 108. And many of you may remember that. And then in 2008, the town started investigating the removal of the McAllen Dam. In 2010, Moody Point started looking into the drinking water quality of the wells there. In 2012, a capital reserve fund was set up for stormwater projects. In 2016, a master plan chapter incorporated climate impacts and adaptation. And then there was another project developing a climate adaptation plan for the Moonlight Brook watershed. In 2017, the town worked with Kyle and Stratford Regional Planning Commission and others on a vulnerability assessment, as well as a groundwater rise study that we'll talk a little bit more about a little bit later. And the town also developed a water system asset management plan and a build-out study for water and sewer. There was continued exploration of options for Moody Point. In 2019, the culvert replacement project at Lubberland Creek with Newmarket, as well as the Nature Conservancy and other partners. And the voters approved a $12.2 million warrant article for water improvements. In 2020, the dam repair starts, and again, the town worked with Stratford Regional Planning Commission on a new water resources master plan chapter that also incorporated climate. And then this year, there's a living shorelines project going on in the Great Bay region, and there's two sites in Newmarket, Shanda Park and the Moody Point sites that are part of that project. And then there was also a grant received for drainage improvements. So I'm sure many of you know more than I do about these various projects and efforts, but maybe some of these you hadn't heard about, or it was a reminder. And so we just kind of wanted to start with this timeline to acknowledge the great work that Newmarket has already done, and thinking about how, what are the next steps, and how can these resources that we'll talk about today help to inform any future actions, whether it's planning, regulatory, spending, on the ground projects, to make sure that they're incorporating current and future flood impacts. So first, we're going to share the New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Summary Part 1 Science report. There's a lengthy science report that we'll share as well, but the video is a 6-minute video to kind of digest some of the key points from that. So it covers sea level rise, storm surge, extreme precipitation, and kind of gives the highlights of that report. So just give me a moment to change my screen over.
Coastal flooding is already a serious problem that coastal New Hampshire communities are facing, and conditions are only expected to get worse in the coming decades, due in part to climate change. Flooding impacts all of us, whether we're right on the coast or further inland. The effects of sea level rise, storms, and more extreme precipitation events put roads, public and private buildings, natural resources, and people at risk. The latest scientific information on coastal flooding for New Hampshire was updated in 2019. The New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Summary, Part 1 Science, provides updated projections of sea level rise, coastal storms, groundwater rise, precipitation, and freshwater flooding for coastal New Hampshire over the next century. The report was developed by top scientists here in New Hampshire with input from local technical experts, climate adaptation practitioners, and external reviewers. Let's take a look at what the science report says. We know that sea levels are rising in New Hampshire and are projected to continue to rise for centuries. Sea levels are rising as a result of ocean warming combined with melting glaciers and ice sheets. Local tide gauge data show that sea level has risen about 7.5 to 8 inches from 1912 to 2018. King tide events like the ones documented in these photos are the highest astronomical tides of the year. In addition to these more extreme events, we know from local tide gauge data and from observations that high tide flooding is occurring on average 2 to 3 days per week in Hampton. These extreme high tides give us a glimpse of what water levels could be like every day in the future. This tells us that we are already seeing the effects of rising seas on New Hampshire's coastal properties, roads, public facilities, human health, public safety, economy, and natural resources. Looking ahead, projections show that if global greenhouse gas concentrations stabilize by the end of the century, coastal New Hampshire is likely to experience between 0.5 foot and 1.3 feet of sea level rise by 2050. It is less likely but possible that sea level rise could exceed 2.9 feet by 2050. After 2050, there is more uncertainty and a larger possible range in the projections. For example, by 2100, still assuming that greenhouse gas concentrations stabilize, coastal New Hampshire is likely to experience between 1 and almost 3 feet of sea level rise, but could see more than 8.7 feet of sea level rise. If global greenhouse gas concentrations continue to grow instead of leveling off, sea level rise projections are even higher. As sea levels rise, we now know that coastal groundwater levels will also rise. In coastal New Hampshire, groundwater rise is projected to extend up to 3 miles inland from the coast. This is about 3 to 4 times farther inland than tidal water inundation from sea level rise. The amount and extent of groundwater rise is influenced by different factors, such as geology and the proximity of streams and freshwater wetlands. Rising groundwater impacts drinking water quality, septic systems, roads, basements, and other underground infrastructure, as well as natural resources like wetlands. Storm surge is the rise in water level above the normal tide as a result of a storm. Studies suggest that future North Atlantic storms could become more intense and more frequent due to warming oceans. We expect to see more damaging storm surge in coastal New Hampshire, both due to greater storm intensity as well as rising seas. Local research also suggests that ocean currents will also increase as sea levels rise, resulting in more erosion and placing property, infrastructure, and wildlife habitat at risk. Today, 24-hour extreme precipitation events drop between 1 to 2 more inches of rain in coastal New Hampshire than they used to in the 1950s. The frequency of these extreme precipitation events is projected to rise over the course of the next several decades, especially in the springtime. This will likely result in a bigger risk of flooding. We have seen freshwater flooding in coastal New Hampshire increase in magnitude and frequency over the past 4 decades in response to both more precipitation and a rise in development in the coastal watershed. More development leads to more pavement and built surfaces, which are impervious, resulting in more stormwater runoff and less infiltration. These trends are expected to continue upward in the future as a result of both climate change and land use change. There is a lot more information to dig into in the science report. This information is the scientific foundation for the companion New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Summary, Part 2, Guidance for Using Scientific Projections, which provides a framework for government officials, businesses, and members of the public to incorporate coastal flood risk information in planning, regulations, and site-specific projects. You can access the science report and the guidance report at the link in the description of this video. This video was funded in part by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Office for Coastal Management under the Coastal Zone Management Act in conjunction with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Coastal Program.
All right, so that was the science video. And if you had any questions or comments, please put those in the chat. And the next thing that we're going to take a look at is some Newmarket specific maps. So I will just pull those back up. Let's see. Looks like Natalie just put a link in the chat. Thanks, Natalie. Okay. So the first two sets of maps are from a resource called the New Hampshire Sea Level Rise Mapper. And that shows, it's an online tool where you can find the sea level rise maps and storm surge maps. And so you'll notice that, so these screenshots of the viewer, I purposefully included the whole kind of stretch of Newmarket shoreline on Great Bay. But you can zoom in a bit to specific locations in Newmarket. So this first map, first we're going to be taking a look at sea level rise projections for Newmarket. And the first map basically shows the mean higher high water baseline, or the average high tide that you might see in any given day. So this purple line is the extent of that average high tide. And that purple outline will remain on the next several maps that show how this would change as sea levels rise. And then on the right, this scale from light to dark blue indicates increasing depth of water levels, from lighter blue colors indicating 0 to 2 or 2 to 4 feet deep water to 8 to 10 or 10 or more feet in the darker blues. So again, this is kind of our baseline high tide. This is adding 1 foot of sea level rise. So you can see how the extent of water begins to increase. Adding 2 feet, adding 4 feet, adding 6 feet, and then 8 feet. And you can kind of look, it's easier kind of looking at the science and the guidance document that we'll take a look at in a few minutes, and the mapper kind of side by side. You can take a look at, the likely projections and cross-reference back to the mapping tool. So I recommend kind of taking a look at both of those in conjunction with each other. But it's kind of a nice way to take those bigger picture projections and scale them down a little bit to the local information. So again, 1 foot, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And you can see that the bulk of the impacts of sea level rise are as expected, along the shoreline. But if you do zoom into the mapping tool, there are some impacts quite a bit inland in Newmarket. So it's depending on where you're located, what kind of project you might be working on, whether it's site specific or something, planning wide that might be community wide. It's helpful to take a look at this kind of information. And then the other nice thing about the viewer is that you can look at surrounding communities. So, maybe there's not a lot of impact to this corridor in Newmarket, but looking at transportation corridors in adjacent communities can be really important for thinking about access and commuting and those sorts of issues. So these are the sea level rise projections that are available for New Hampshire. And then next we'll take a look at what it looks like with a storm kind of layered on top of that. So this, again, the purple line is that average high tide extent. This yellow shading is basically the current extent of a 1% annual chance storm. So we know that kind of the 100-year storm event is happening more frequently than once every 100 years. So that terminology can be kind of confusing, but basically taking a look at this certain size storm and the storm surge associated with it, this is where the water levels would extend to currently. If we're looking out to the future and we're adding 2 feet of sea level rise, that same size storm would then have this extent and depth of water. So again, the same kind of scale of blue on the right here. And then, so adding 2 feet of sea level rise with that storm, this is the kind of impacts to be planning for. And then again, it walks through the 4 feet of sea level rise, 6 feet, and 8 feet. And you can see, that the impacts, both the extent and the depth of inundation really start to increase with the higher sea levels in particular. And again, you can zoom into to take a look at some more detailed areas. And so important when thinking about emergency management and preparedness, and also just acknowledging that we expect storms to get increasingly severe and more frequent. So planning ahead for those storms is really important, in addition to planning kind of for the long-term changes in sea levels. So the other resource that we wanted to highlight is Newmarket's groundwater rise study. And as you saw in the science video, the science report and the online mapping tool do show groundwater rise, although that mapping was done for kind of a subset of coastal New Hampshire's communities, not including Newmarket. But the great thing is that Newmarket had its own groundwater rise study done back in 2017. So the available maps from that report, which we can share the link to that report as well, but show the amount of groundwater rise that we expect to see with different amounts of sea level rise. So this one in the top left corner is with 1 foot of sea level rise. This is the amount of groundwater rise that we expect to see. So 0 to 1, maybe 2 feet. And then 2.7 feet of sea level rise, we would expect in these areas 2 to 3 feet of groundwater rise. 5.2 feet of sea level rise, this is the amount of groundwater rise that's projected, and 6.6 feet of sea level rise, that's the amount of groundwater rise that's projected. So this basically, depending on where the current groundwater levels are, the amount of groundwater rise will have different impacts. Like if the groundwater is already pretty close to the surface, then a small increase in sea level will result in some more significant impacts. But where there's greater distance to the surface, then it won't have as much of an impact. So another piece that the study layered on is looking at drinking water wells and potential contamination sites. So it's great that Newmarket has this this resource that has been done for the town to kind of look at not just the surface above ground impacts of sea level rise, but also the below ground impacts. So that covered sea level rise, storm surge, and a little bit of groundwater rise. And we have a couple more maps that I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to share. And Amanda, you are on mute.
Yeah, always forget that. So I'm going to share a couple of maps from the land conservation priorities of the Textual Coastal Resources report that was done by the Nature Conservancy back in 2016. And so what this does is identifies land areas in New Hampshire's coastal watershed that provide benefits for water quality and for flood risk attenuation. So since we've just been talking about the coastal area, I'm going to actually focus on this side of the map around Great Bay. Those aqua turquoise areas that you're looking at, those are salt marsh areas classified as estuarine waters. And in the pink areas you see adjacent to those are areas where salt marshes can migrate. So there's salt marsh migration opportunity areas. There's an opportunity to protect those areas, which will allow the salt marshes to move in and as they become inundated as a result of rising sea levels. And the reason why this is important is that salt marshes provide protection, they reduce wave energy, and they reduce erosion. And so they're really important natural protection mechanism. But as they get inundated by rising seas, if there are naturally vegetated places where those salt marsh plants can recolonize, they will migrate inland so that we can maintain that natural protective barrier, which is really one of nature's best solutions, so to speak. So this highlights some of those areas. You'll see the tax map is overlaid, so you can actually see the tax map parcels here. And you can see where there may be opportunities to protect some of those salt marsh migration areas so we don't lose those into the future. And looking at this map, so looking up in this area over here, you've done a lot of land protection that has protected some of those areas. And then looking down here, there's definitely some areas where there's an opportunity for additional protection. We recognize that you can't protect everything, but this helps give you an idea of where there may be opportunities for protection in the future that will benefit Newmarket over the years as we see a changing climate. And I may not have mentioned at the beginning, this whole report was developed in the context of our changing climate and where those resources are that can help to ameliorate flood risk reduction. So moving from the salt marshes to inland, you see these bright yellow areas. These are areas associated with wetlands, which are shown in blue. And these are areas that are low-lying in the landscape. They're upland areas shown in yellow, but they provide areas where flood waters can be stored and reduce damage to people and property and ameliorate the effects of those floods in general. So these are also areas that you could focus on for potential protection. You'll see that the crosshatched areas here, that was the existing conservation lands data layer that we currently have. It's about to be updated, so maybe a little bit out of date. The areas shown in crosshatch and white are town-owned lands that may not have some level of specific protection associated with them. Keep in mind that could have changed since the last version of this map was created. So I'm going to go on to the next map. And so this is looking now at water quality. And this is looking at water quality in the context of buffers around wetlands, around streams, and freshwater sources. And so you'll see two different color codes here. And so the orange color, the darker orange color, these are protection priorities where the, let me check that I've got that, I think I've got that the right way around. So the protection priorities are areas where the buffers are in pretty good condition. And so they should be protected as intact buffers. They can protect the water quality in streams. They also provide protection against flood producing flows. So you've got a kind of a double benefit there. And then the areas that are shown in yellow are buffer areas that have restoration potential. They may already have had some form of conversion, which is likely to be removal of trees, could be a grassed area, but it still has potential for restoration. There isn't any hard infrastructure there that makes it, well, there's not a lot of hard infrastructure, put it that way. They do have potential for restoration. And so you can also look at these as another protection mechanism. So this is part of the overall package of what you're looking at, along with the previous data that Lisa showed you, that you can be thinking about in terms of important resources to protect Newmarket, protect yourself in the future in the context of rising seas, more intense rainfalls, more inland flooding, as well as coastal flooding, freshwater flooding as well. And you can get a look at those maps in more detail. So I think that covers it, Lisa. And I think we probably have about 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to stop sharing. So before we move on to the next video, which will show the coastal flood risk guidance, does anybody have any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat yet. Are there any questions on what you've seen so far regarding the maps, the science that was presented, what you see for Newmarket? Did anything surprise you that you weren't aware of, or something reinforced for you that you were already aware of? You can either unmute yourself, because I can't see anybody, so if you raise your hands, I won't see it. You can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. And if we don't have any questions or comments now, we will have we'll have an open question time when everybody put their videos back on, and we can take more questions and comments. Okay, so Lisa, I think let's move on with the guidance video.
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. So I know we kind of threw a lot of maps and information at you, and the next piece is the guidance resource that is available to help kind of walk through the information. So this will provide hopefully kind of a tangible way to think about how you might use this information, because I know it's a lot to digest.
Maybe you're a town planner working on updating your community's master plan, a municipal board member making decisions about development applications, an engineer designing a culvert, or a contractor working with a coastal homeowner on some renovations. You know that flooding and storms are already impacting communities in coastal New Hampshire, and that these issues are projected to become even bigger challenges with climate change. You may be wondering how to incorporate the latest coastal flooding science into your project. A good place to start is the New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Guidance, which provides a step-by-step approach for using the latest local scientific information about sea level rise, storm surge, extreme precipitation, groundwater rise, and freshwater flooding. The guidance is designed for municipal staff and volunteer board members, state agency staff, professional consultants, and coastal residents. The guidance can be applied to a wide range of projects, including planning projects like master plan updates and capital improvement plans, regulatory projects such as improving floodplain regulations, and site-specific projects, including both new construction and redevelopment or relocation of buildings, infrastructure, and other assets. Both the state wetland regulations, which protect tidal and freshwater wetland resources, and the alteration of terrain rules, which ensure large development projects adequately control and treat stormwater, now require permit applicants to consider the coastal flood risk guidance. Municipalities can also take similar approaches and reference the guidance in their own land use regulations. The guidance outlines a 7-step process for incorporating coastal flood risk in decisions. This approach is intended to be iterative. You may need to go back and forth between steps and adjust along the way. There is also a companion worksheet that guides you through the process. Let's take a look at the steps. First, identify the type of project and the time frame. For example, the planning horizon for a master plan update project might be 30 years, with incremental updates every 5 to 10 years. The useful life of a new hospital building might be over 100 years, assuming regular maintenance. Next, determine the project's tolerance for flood risk. Tolerance for flood risk means an individual's or a community's willingness to accept a higher or lower probability of flood impacts based on several project characteristics and regardless of the actual risk of flooding to the project. It's a subjective concept, so your tolerance for flood risk might be different than my own. Tolerance for flood risk may be higher or lower depending on how much you value the project, how damaged it would be if it flooded, how difficult it would be to adapt to future flood risk, and how important it is for public function or safety. For example, a project like building a new hospital or upgrading a wastewater treatment facility would likely fall into the low or very low tolerance for flood risk category. These facilities would be expensive to replace, may be difficult to modify once constructed, and play a critical role in public function and safety. As a result of their low tolerance for flood risk, these projects should plan for higher amounts of flooding that may be less likely but would cause devastating consequences if they were to occur. On the other hand, a project to build a walking trail may have a high tolerance for flood risk, considering it is relatively low cost to replace, pretty easy to modify once constructed, and not very important for public safety. These types of projects can typically plan for lower amounts of flooding. After identifying the project's tolerance for flood risk, the guidance helps you determine which sea level rise estimates to use in planning. The online New Hampshire Sea Level Rise Mapper provides maps showing depth and extent of water levels with different amounts of sea level rise. Here's an example of how the town of Newmarket incorporated sea level rise projections in a site-specific project to replace an undersized culvert where Bay Road crosses Lumberland Creek. The project team planned for 3.7 feet of sea level rise by the year 2115, which is in line with the guidance for a project with high tolerance for flood risk and approximately 100 years of useful life. The redesigned culvert, pictured here, reduces flood risk, improves aquatic organism passage, and allows for future migration of the salt marsh as sea levels rise. Next, you'll want to consider how coastal storms on top of higher sea levels may magnify flooding impacts to your project. The online New Hampshire Sea Level Rise Mapper shows how the current 100-year floodplain may expand in the future under various sea level rise scenarios. The guidance can also help you figure out the appropriate design flood elevation, or how high you should elevate your project above current flood levels in order to account for sea level rise. The City of Portsmouth recently updated its zoning ordinance to create an extended flood hazard area within which new construction is required to build to at least 2 feet above base flood elevation. This is an example of a regulatory project that provides protection against increased flood risk. We now know more about the below-ground impacts of rising seas. As sea level rises, fresh groundwater does too. Rising groundwater levels are projected to have impacts further inland than surface water flooding from sea level rise. The guidance helps determine the amount of projected groundwater rise for your particular project. Projected groundwater rise has been mapped for some coastal New Hampshire communities, and available maps can be explored on the New Hampshire Sea Level Rise Mapper. Coastal New Hampshire communities are starting to experience, study, and address issues related to rising groundwater levels. For example, the City of Portsmouth surveyed property owners in the historic district to assess basement flooding issues associated with tidal events and heavy precipitation. The town of Durham is completing a modeling study to determine the potential impacts of rising groundwater levels on infrastructure and water quality. The study followed an approach consistent with the guidance to select the appropriate sea level rise scenarios to simulate groundwater rise and changing aquifer recharge in town. Using the model results, project partners will complete a vulnerability assessment to identify at-risk areas and critical facilities, including things like private drinking water wells and septic systems, utility infrastructure, hazardous waste and contaminated areas, and stormwater systems. In addition to sea level rise, storm surge, and groundwater rise, the guidance directs you to plan for more extreme rain events. Increasing precipitation intensity will result in greater freshwater flooding. The guidance recommends that projects plan for at least a 15% increase in extreme precipitation estimates, rather than relying on historical rates. Recently, the town of Lee undertook a modeling study to develop flood inundation maps that incorporate current and projected 100-year flood events based on future land use changes and rainfall estimates. The town is finalizing updates to its floodplain ordinance to incorporate the new maps, as well as best practices for floodplain management. The last step is to bring all of these considerations together, assess cumulative risk, and identify and evaluate adaptation options. Options can range from taking no action to relocating assets out of harm's way. For example, the town of Hampton conducted a flood mitigation analysis for 2 low-lying neighborhoods that used high-quality sea level rise and storm surge modeling to investigate alternatives to reduce future flood risks. The study evaluated options across the avoid, accommodate, resist, and relocate spectrum. For example, a recommended option in the avoid category is to evaluate zoning ordinance and site plan regulation changes in order to limit and manage expansion and growth of development in flood-prone areas. Recommended options in the accommodate category include improving drainage and restoring the marsh. Installing an earthen berm to block tidal flooding is an example of a resist strategy. And in the relocate category, a recommended option is to continue to investigate the use of managed retreat, which would remove buildings and impervious cover and restore the floodplain. Alternatives were evaluated based on their ability to reduce flooding and erosion, increase public safety, and naturalize the marsh, along with permitting feasibility and cost of implementation and maintenance. The guidance worksheet, which appears at the back of the report, helps evaluate adaptation options based on the degree to which they mitigate flood risk and meet the project goals. The guidance also outlines a set of guiding principles, which should be considered when evaluating options. These include, for example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, considering the impacts on vulnerable populations, adopting a flexible adaptation approach, and considering the liability of not taking action. There are many ways to apply the guidance to make projects and decisions more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Planning ahead for coastal flood risks is essential to save lives and money, sustain quality of life, and protect New Hampshire's coastal resources. The best way to learn how to use the guidance is to take an example project and walk through the step-by-step process. Our team is available to help you do that. Find the guidance document, additional resources, and contact information for assistance at the link in the video description. This video was funded in part by
Okay, so folks, if you want to put your cameras on, if you don't have bandwidth issues, it's helpful just to see people when we're having discussions. So you can feel free to put your cameras on, and you can use the raise hand function, so we can move into some questions and discussion. Okay, let's start seeing a few people. This is one thing with Zoom, is you can't always see everybody in the room. And we totally understand bandwidth issues, but it's sometimes a bit weird when you see all these little black boxes. Okay, Michael, you've raised your hand. Go ahead.
Hi, I just unmuted. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for holding this forum. I own 8 Exeter Road, which is kind of at the bottom of what they're calling the bowl in town. And while I appreciate all the presentations you've had, most of them have been based on coastal areas. We do have this sort of special spot in the middle of town that is affected by high rainfall. And specifically, this may be a question for Tony, but I've been trying to get the town DPW interested in the drainage to the north of my building between 8 Exeter Road and the Floor of Interest parking lot, where there's basically an underground stream that runs through there. And while we had the May 2006 event, which everyone knows about, which, you know, there's a photograph of my building on your I'm the cover child there. There was an event in 2016 also that was, I think, a failure of that infrastructure. So I'd love to get the town interested in repairing that infrastructure. The parking lot in Flora Ventures, behind Flora Ventures, develops holes in it, a sign that something is not good underneath that lot. And the DPW does patch those holes. They also come back and they clear a drainage point that's between my property and a neighboring property that's critical. So while this is sort of different from what you've been talking about, it's something that affects not just me, but neighboring properties across the street from me, and any cars that are parked on the street. And that 2016 event, there were several cars that were ruined, including one of mine. If Tony could speak to this, what the mechanism might be to getting the town's attention on this.
Actually, I'll speak to it. Those who don't know me, I'm Steve Forney, I'm the town manager. And yes, we understand the 2016 issue. There was a flow issue at that point in time during that flood as well, including beaver dams in the actual culverts underneath there. And the culverts underneath the road right there are pretty tall. I mean, you could walk through some of those. So we did remove those at that time. In addition, we are now, we have bonded and should be doing construction on additional outflow capacity on New Road. And that will additionally help for the bowl area to drain out to the Great Bay. So you'll have consistent flows instead of having backups where we already did improve it. We purchased a piece of property on New Road that will be a retaining pond. So if the water does get too big, it will go into a retaining pond and then out to Great Bay, or out to the river to the bay. So we are addressing the issues there by increasing the amount of flow to be able to go through there.
Okay. Just one more point, if it would be possible to show you this piece of infrastructure that's to the north of my building, I would like to do that. It's kind of a peculiar thing because I don't know like whose land it's actually on. The DPW does occasionally come in and remove leaves in the vicinity because that 2016 event was also, other things that contributed to it were all the leaves that fell, blocked drainage, and a failure just by blocked drains.
Yeah, October is usually, this time of year is our worst time when it comes to flooding, just because of the number of the leaves and other materials that are out there. But yeah, no, I can talk to the public works director and come out and look at it, take some pictures, and we can go from there and include it in future investigations for the area if we have issues.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks.
And just speaking to Michael's comments, while we certainly there's a lot of focus on the Atlantic coast, but the focus really of the flood risk summary guidance is on Great Bay as well, where you may not be in the same position as the Atlantic coast. You're on Great Bay, but we also take consideration of inland flooding issues, which are part of coastal storms. So it is important to be cognizant of those impacts as well as coastal impacts. And so that is a big issue. And that's where we've brought in some of those additional maps to look at some of those inland issues where you can take some actions. So that's important to look at as well. Think of culverts that are undersized. You've got the Loverland Creek example, which is used in the guidance booklet as well, to show how resizing the culverts for those bigger storms it can save a lot of money down the road and provides a lot of benefits as well in terms of reducing those flood reducing flows, which are otherwise you'd have road collapse and more flooding. So there's a lot of solutions that you can look at. It's sort of a multi-pronged approach. And Kyle Penenthal made the comment that the guidance could be especially useful during capital improvements planning. That's a good point, Kyle. We have a question from Gretchen. How would private property owners or developers use the guidance? And I'm going to turn that one over to Natalie.
That's a great question. I think so far we have seen consultants that are helping private property owners with development applications use the guidance to design their projects. So if you follow the 7-step process, it'll help you assess the vulnerability of your project to the various coastal flood risks that Amanda and Lisa just chatted about and that you learned about in the video. But also it helps, step 7 in particular helps folks think about the different adaptation strategies that might be viable to help address some of those coastal flood risks, or at the very least to help mitigate them. And so it walks you through evaluating adaptation strategies that might fall within that take no action, avoid, accommodate, protect spectrum of strategies, and essentially walks you through the decision-making process and helps you think about different considerations that you may need to take into account when designing your project. As was mentioned in the video that you just watched on the guidance, the state wetland rules and the state alteration of terrain permit regulations now require applicants to follow the guidance in full or in part, depending on the project. And so that's one really concrete application example that I can point to. People who are located within the state's tidal wetland buffer zone are now required to actually complete a coastal vulnerability assessment that's more or less consistent with the guidance and demonstrate how the project is designed in order to mitigate some of those vulnerabilities. So hopefully that helps answer your question, Gretchen, but let me know if you want more detail on that.
And feel free to unmute if you want to say anything further. Just if there's anybody else whose video is locked and they can't put it on, let me know. I know a couple of people couldn't have their videos on, so but I can do that as a co-host, or Steve can do it. So I know some of you have bandwidth issues, so no biggie. But other questions, comments, or need for clarification that people have? How do you, any other thoughts on using the coastal flood risk guidance or something that you learned that you weren't previously aware of? I'll bring forward Kyle's comment right now. In addition to Natalie's comments, there were several engineers that often work with developers that were part of the development of the guidance. People, a lot of different experience and expertise that put this guidance together. We'll make sure that we email the links to everybody. We've got them in the chat, but we'll send you the links to the 2 documents as well as the 2 videos so you can take a look at that information again. Go ahead, Tony.
Hi, so just a quick question. Gretchen's question sort of had me thinking, wondering if there are resources or information that might be available to homeowners or landowners who aren't necessarily in the flood risk area, but like just small steps that we could take on our own properties that might be beneficial. I know like we've had presentations in the past about implementing rain gardens and that sort of thing. So is there like a one-stop shop where we can find that information?
It probably will be in the future as we're developing a website for the coastal flood risk summary and then linking people to other areas where they can find some of that information. So it will be coming soon, with soon being probably the first half of next year, and we'll let people know when that is available, so that you can go to one place and then locate a number of different resources as well as a coastal flood summary. Natalie.
Thank you for
Yeah.
asking that question. I was going
Go
to
ahead,
add
Ingrid.
diverting, something as simple as diverting downspouts so that they go into the yard instead of onto the driveways and down into the storm sewers would reduce maybe some of that runoff. But I'm not an engineer. I have no way of knowing how much that would help to have lots of folks in the town just divert their downspout so it goes into their yard or into a garden or something.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ingrid. I think any action you can take to disconnect what they call impervious cover or impervious surfaces is really helpful for reducing runoff, and may help to mitigate some of the flooding that you've experienced in the bowl area, for sure. I don't know if it would apply to properties outside of the floodplain necessarily that you were referencing, Tony, but there is also a program called the Landowner Technical Assistance Program that is a partnership between UNH Cooperative Extension and the New Hampshire Coastal Program. And they actually go out and do site visits to interested property owners and evaluate flood risk to those properties and help them identify some conceptual options. Historically, those visits have been really concentrated in our 7 Atlantic coast communities, but there have been property owners in Newmarket. For example, I think the Moody Point development had the program come out to do a site visit. And that was kind of the genesis of the Great Bay Living Shoreline Project taking place at Moody Point. So I can share a link to the program unless Lisa has already done that in the chat. And it's a really easy program to sign up for. You just shoot them an email and they'll respond. You'll have to, I think, fill out a survey, and then they will schedule a site visit. So that could also be helpful to property owners in Newmarket. So certainly something to look into.
Definitely, and we'll make sure we capture all these links and send them an email as well. Something I just wanted to mention is that property owners that do have water frontage, whether it is on Great Bay or whether it's on a stream, some other water body, a wetland, there's certain things that they can do in their yards where that area that fronts onto the stream, where they can actually plant shrubs and other vegetation to provide that buffer instead of having, grass, which is sort of like a semi-impervious surface, but planting that vegetation that really helps protect that buffer. And collective action is really helpful, that if people in town are more aware of the actions they can take, then the actions that a number of people take are going to be more effective than what just one person can do. So there's definitely things people can do in their yards, and just to raise their level of awareness of the things they can do, but the other things that need to be done in town, that they can help support potential projects that might come up in the future and require voter support. So that's something else to think about. Gretchen, you've had your hand raised.
Yes, I was wondering, you'd said that we realized that the flooding that happened in Newmarket in the last decade was not really a 100-year flood anymore, that we can expect that to happen more. I think it left it acquainted people with what is coming. But which of the scenarios or levels that were covered in the materials presented earlier in the meeting would we equate that level of flooding to, just so people know what they have a physical representation and a memory of that kind of flooding? Where does that fall in the spectrum of scenarios that have been presented earlier, so that people can kind of equate the level of damage and flooding and precipitation that happened to what's coming?
So, Natalie, would you want to take that on?
That's a really good question, Gretchen, and I wish I had the answer off the top of my head for you. I can certainly consult some of the freshwater specialists that were involved in developing the guidance and hopefully try to get an answer for you. Typically, when we are looking at extreme precipitation estimates, the guidance recommends planning for at least a 15% increase in precipitation estimates. And a stormwater designer, for example, would look at the present day precipitation estimates for that 100-year flood, for example, and then multiply the volume by 15%. And those estimates are available through a data set that's publicly online. But that doesn't get to your question. So I will definitely follow up with a more eloquent answer for you and one that's correct.
I think it would be helpful to have that kind of practical, using that flooding as an example, so that people can understand, you know, what's coming better is what I'm.
Yeah,
we have something.
We have. Yeah, we have anecdotal evidence on the coast that suffered damages from like the 2018 storms, and those were considered 100-year storms. So we were able to equate like the total water levels that were registered at the tide gauge with those storm scenarios, but we don't have similar kind of comparisons for more inland communities. So I think that's a great point and something that we can work on putting together as part of future outreach. So thank you for that.
Good ideas. So Brian has a comment or a question rather. Are there any opportunities to work with other seacoast towns on proactive flood prevention and management projects? And this is a good point because no town exists on its own. That, you know, we're all sort of, we just have political boundaries, simply lines of the landscape, and that everything obviously happens at a much bigger scale. And I'm actually going to turn to Kyle from his Stratford Regional Planning Commission perspective. And have you had any towns collaborating? Do you see some potential opportunities for towns to collaborate? Certainly there's been collaboration on transportation corridors because that affects everybody, having safe evacuation routes when there is flooding. So it's a good question. This is something communities do need to think about, is work collaboratively on projects.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have any examples of sort of proactive flood prevention or management projects off the top of my head. I think that there are probably some that have been done that have been inadvertently sort of regional in focus. An example might be on Route 4 in Durham. They replaced a bridge over, it was either Bunker Creek or Johnson Creek. You know, the state improved that bridge, and that's a major transportation corridor and emergency evacuation route and a connector between Dover, Durham, and Portsmouth for mutual aid purposes. So if, you know, something like that were to get knocked out or be flooded, it would create major delays in emergency response times, you know, in a regional perspective. So I don't know if Durham or the state DOT was kind of thinking about a regional, you know, the regional implications of a major, you know, construction project like that. But it certainly is applicable. But I'd have to think about how, a little bit more about how other towns might be taking flood prevention and management projects at a regional level. I can't think of any like off the top of my head. I know that there has been some with like groundwater, you know, wellhead areas and drinking water protection that's been more regional, but I don't really know if there's been like flood efforts. I'd have to kind of think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, that was a great question, Brian, and something we need to do some more thinking around and maybe get some resources around that. So thanks for asking that. Dale, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, you know, this is sort of a thank you to Diane and to Kyle. They nominated me to be on that Coastal Adaptation Work Group Municipal Committee, which has been an interesting experience. But one of the things that comes out and was sort of the genesis of this meeting was the importance. Many of these adaptations will involve several boards and committees within the town. And virtually every town in this region, struggles to communicate between those boards and committees. And, heard some good ideas, which I talked to Steve and Tony about, where towns are trying to have periodic, maybe annual, all boards type meetings where a speaker comes in. And then it provides an opportunity for goal setting to think about, what are the action steps that, the town needs to be involved in to better adapt to climate change and greater flooding risk.
Definitely. And, to that point, and also Brian's point, Lisa and I have worked with Exeter. We're currently working with Dover. We just had a meeting with Newcastle yesterday with these all boards meetings and getting everybody together to start thinking about these issues. And really, a lot of the towns around you, those around Great Bay, are definitely thinking about these issues. And there's a lot of information sharing that could be happening. And at some future point, I'm just sort of brainstorming. There could be an opportunity for those towns to share information on what they're working on, because there's nothing better than learning from what somebody else is doing. Say, oh, we can do that too. We'll just keep all of that in mind. This is raising a lot of good issues and questions for us to be considering as well. Tony had a comment that she lives in the Tuttle Swamp area, and that was on that the land conservation priorities map that I reviewed. She said she found it really useful because she typically didn't think of her area being impacted by sea level change, and appreciates that. And I think the thing is that, being able to share maps with people and having some way to share that information online through your website, it does give people a perspective they might not have had previously, because, you don't really see that information when you're kind of in town. It's like getting that bird's eye view that you get from a map, and you start looking at things a little bit differently. So they can be a helpful outreach tool, because really outreach and education amongst the community is one of the ways to start getting people understanding the issues and to start getting them on board. And there's definitely a lot of work that can still be done in that regard. Other questions or comments that people have at this point? I will actually say too, is what some of these other communities we're working with have done is they are putting all of their climate related documents and studies and other work that they've done online on a web page where all that information is together in one place. And that may be something that Newmarket wants to think about. It makes it much more easily accessible. That is, those of you who are board members, it's like, what was that resource that they talked about? And you can go to that one page, you can find all the resources that relate to climate adaptation, climate change, etc. So that's something good to think about. We do have another comment here from Brian. For private well owners that will be impacted by sea level rise, what can be done? Can we modify them, or will the owners need new wells to be attached to groundwater, to town water? So it's really looking at, what happens when you have basically saltwater intrusion into wells. That is a tough issue. Kyle, have you addressed this at all with the groundwater rise study? Was that something they've looked at? I know Moody Point's had some saline intrusion, but it may not necessarily, that may have been an overpumping issue. So I'm turning to you as the local expert on that.
Well, I'd say I'm far from a groundwater rise expert, but it's, that's a tough question when we've looked at both private wells and septic systems, with the Newmarket groundwater rise project, and we're also doing one in Durham right now. And so, the Moody Point, issue, or what was going on there, it was sort of a perfect storm of where they were, the geology of the land there, as well as the three separate pumping, the mechanisms that they were doing in order to blend their water. In terms of a private resident with a well, I think it's going to depend on sort of the cost of whether it needs to be treated. If you start getting beyond what the EPA's drinking water standards are, something is going to have to be done, whether or not you tie into the municipal system, if that's even available to you, or having to potentially move your well, or dig a more shallow well. But what we did find with the Newmarket is what you'd expect: the deeper the well, the more likely or the higher the concentrations of salinity. So potentially if there's an opportunity to dig a more shallow well, or looking into new technology for treatment. I mean, I think in some of these spots that might be your only options. I don't know of other reasonable or sustainable options. I mean, you're not going to truck in water for the long-term future. So I mean, I think that those are some of the things that we have seen. But Jennifer Jacobs and Jane Knott, they're sort of the lead scientists that are looking into the groundwater modeling, and so they might be someone to talk to about what their opinions are about solutions for private drinking water wells.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. It's definitely an issue. It's not easy to reverse saltwater intrusion in wells, but it's something we need to be considering going into the future. I have another question here from Bob. What is the actual status of some of these maps, and how do we keep our overlays up to date? And yes, that is something that we do need to be doing over time, is keeping maps and data layers up to date. The data that is available through the mappers, it's drawing on whether the current source of information is. So through our statewide Granite database system, as data layers are updated and become available, those can be incorporated into existing maps. And there may be other work that is done more locally, either by the town, by the planning commission. One of the data layers that is only, for example, conservation public lands data layer is only updated every few years. So there are some data layers that don't get updated every year. And depending on how the system is changing, some don't need to be updated every year. But we always try to work with the most up-to-date versions of maps that we can. And the technology the way it is these days, that has become more feasible as we get new information. Does anybody else want to add to that? Natalie, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the science has to be updated every 5 years. So that the most recent science report that we have is from 2019. So it'll be updated regularly, which is, I think, a real strength of it, that there's a requirement to revisit it and update it to make sure that it's the best available. I don't know if Natalie, you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that the sea level rise maps have a pretty long useful life, for lack of a better word. The maps present different inundation associated with different sea level rise scenarios. So we have maps for 1 foot of sea level rise, maps for 2, 4, 6, and 8 feet of sea level rise. And the way that they've been mapped is that it's not tied to a particular projection or global greenhouse gas concentration scenario, or anything like that. Really, the only time we would update those maps is if we get new digital elevation data or LiDAR, which we are getting hopefully any day now. And so my guess is that we would rerun these what are called bathtub sea level rise inundation models to create new maps in conjunction with the release of the next science report update, which is slated to take place in 2024. So aside from that, I think the maps are good to go as long as we don't have any changes in elevation.
Thanks, Natalie. Bob, did you still want to say something? I was going to the hands raised next, or you all set?
I was just looking at it. I'm on the zoning board, and I just want to make sure that when some people come in and are asking for relief from some restrictive elements, that we're dealing with the most current information. And off the top of my head, I don't remember if our zoning ordinance says the latest and greatest iteration of these maps, or whether it's based on a specific date. And I think that's something we've got to look into internally. So I'll deal with Diane with that later on.
Yeah, that's a good point, Diane. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I was actually, for some reason, I'm not seeing Steve right now. I wonder if he may not be on right at the moment.
Yeah, Steve, hop off.
Okay. Yeah, those are good points, Bob, and we've captured that information, and we'll get that back to the town for Steve, Diane, and others to consider. So thanks for considering that. I just want to go to a couple of quick points, and yes, Gretchen had a good point that we are wanting communities to think about using the community flood risk guidance tool. So it's definitely something to consider. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, we are willing to provide assistance with projects moving forward. So as you need assistance, please let us know. And Natalie at DES is available as well to help with that. So yeah, just feel free to message us when you have a project you're working on, need assistance with, and the team can certainly move in to help with that. And before I go to you, Dale, I'm just going to a comment from Patrick Reynolds that as the town considers future planning for development, the areas of concern for flooding often overlap with some of the areas that town is focused on developing. I think this presentation points out that planning for flooding must be part of those plans for development, and in particular, our wetlands must be protected as part of any plans for development or redevelopment. And yes, those are all good points. What a community needs to decide is where are the important natural resources they need to protect, and where are the best places for development to be located, so you protect those important resources, but also have places where development is more appropriate, so you can balance that out. Because protecting your natural resources is really one of the most important things in the context of climate change. You don't want to increase the amount of impervious surfaces. You want to be able to maintain that natural hydrology, that natural landscape that maintains our water quality, and also controls our storm producing flows as much as possible. Obviously, you can't protect everything, and that's why you need to prioritize. And so some of those map resources that we reviewed earlier can provide some of that information. For example, the Conservation Commission can be looking at those, the land conservation priority maps that I shared with you earlier. That's something that they could be taking a look at and sharing with other boards. So there's definitely two sides of the coin when it comes to conservation and development. You want to do what works best in terms of protecting those natural resources, but recognize that development is happening too, and where it's best to locate that. Does anyone else want to comment there? No one else from the team. And then Gretchen's commenting the changes to stormwater regulations have addressed some of that, at least from a new development perspective, particularly impervious surfaces, and that is good. There's always more work to be done as well. Okay, Dale.
Well, the only thing I was going to add to what Kyle said about the saltwater intrusion is that, you know, as sea level rise, as it increases, will maybe more of an issue, but along a lot of these aquifers, it's how much you're pumping out. So that may have questions if they're not on municipal water, that will come back to planning boards in terms of density, and they have to factor in how much pumping is going on when they think about density for some of the coastal areas.
Right. Yeah. No, this generates a lot of good. I'm glad you're all thinking about these things. This is what this presentation is intended to, is generate thinking and questioning and thinking about you know, planning for moving forward. And so in addition to providing systems of guidance, if there's any of the boards that would like assistance with any aspect of this, we'd be happy to do so. We have worked with other conservation commissions on the land conservation priorities piece, looking at those two maps that we had a look at. We'd be happy to meet with a conservation commission in that context, or meet with other boards that may want some specific assistance or guidance for those board members. Any other thoughts or comments in closing? As we move towards our end time, and then Matthew, Lisa, and Kyle, anything else that you would like to say in closing?
Yeah, I just want to, we'll follow up with the links and resources that we mentioned. And I just want to encourage you to share that with other members of your board or committee, other neighbors that you know and that you think might be interested in this. And that will also include our contact information so you can follow up if needed. And one other thing that I wanted to also mention is the Rising Tides photo contest, which starts tomorrow and runs through Monday. And that's a way that we try to document the impacts of rising tides and flooding in our coastal communities. And it'd be great to get some submissions from Newmarket. So I'll put a link to that in the chat as well as in our follow-up email if you want to either participate or stay tuned for the public voting on the submissions. So thanks.
Thank you. Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, before we wrap up, I just wanted to make sure that I thanked everybody for putting this presentation together and then also for being here. We had, and I know that our presenters don't necessarily know this, but we had representatives from the town council, from the planning board, from the ZBA, from the Riverfront Advisory Committee, from the Budget Committee, from the Conservation Commission, and then we had town staff. So it wasn't every member of every committee, but it was very broad representation. So so thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day for being a part of this.
And that's a really good point, Tony. This is great representation from across the town boards, as well as others, committees as well. And I encourage you all to take this information you've learned and the links that we send you back to the boards and committees that you're working with to share with other people who weren't able to be on the program today. Please go ahead and do that as well. Did I see someone else raise their hand?
Maybe just to speak Diane's comment, she says she doesn't have a microphone. Working on the last few months in updating the stormwater regulations, and we'll be presenting them to the full planning board shortly for adoption and implementation to address some of these issues. So stay tuned. So thanks, Diane, for sharing that. I know there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. So it's good to be sharing those efforts so that everyone's in the loop. All right.
Any last burning questions or comments before we let you all go?